saved a U.S. senator's life on the battlefield, and the senator forgot his name. They honored his courage with silence and buried his legacy under bureaucracy. Justice isn't broken. It's designed this way. Miss this and you'll never see the truth behind the lie. The bell rang. Harsh, metallic, cold. Tomas Whitecloud stood outside room 203, his hands clenched tightly around the frayed edges of his notebook. The wind blew dust across the schoolyard behind him, and from inside he could already hear the familiar voice barking roll call. He took a breath, stepped inside. The classroom fell silent as soon as he entered. Mr. Carter turned from the chalkboard, chalk still in hand, his brow furrowed like he was already annoyed, like Tomas had disrupted the air just by existing. "Glad you could join us, Mr. Whitecloud," the teacher said, his voice dripping with that flat, forced civility. "We were just reviewing the Founding Fathers. Try to keep up." Tomas nodded and found his seat. Third row from the back, next to the window, the one he liked, because he could see the tree line. The only place in this town that still felt like home. As Mr. Carter droned on about Jefferson and liberty and the great American experiment, Tomas stared down at the pages in his notebook. Carefully, he'd written the word freedom in both English and Ojibwe. Beneath it, he was starting a list his people's words for land, water, sky. Then he heard it. A whisper from behind. "You're not even American. Why do you care about history class?" The words hit like a rock in the back of the head. Not loud enough for the teacher, but loud enough for everyone else. Some students snickered. Others stared at their desks. Tomas didn't turn around. He didn't need to. It was always the same few boys. He focused on his notebook, wrote a new word, Nita Izhi Bimadizawan, to live in a good way. But the whisper must have carried. Mr. Carter spun around. "Mr. Whitecloud, what language are you using?" Tomas froze. His pencil slipped, a streak across the paper. It's Ojibwe, sir." Mr. Carter's face tightened. "This is an American school. We speak English here, only English." Tomas swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Bring me your notebook." He hesitated, then rose, walking to the front, like a man walking to judgment. Mr. Carter flipped through the pages with a sneer, then tore out the ones written in Ojibwe and held them up. "This," he said, turning to the class, "is what we're trying to correct. These children come here to become civilized, but they bring this with them, this backward nonsense. Mr. Whitecloud, you'll stay after class." Tomas felt the heat rise in his cheeks, the sting of shame, but more than that, rage. Quiet, coiled rage. After the bell rang, the others filed out. Tomas stayed behind, shoulders squared. "You want to live in this country?" Mr. Carter said, leaning on the desk. "You want to be American? Then stop clinging to ghosts. Start acting like one of us." Tomas didn't answer. He stared at the torn pages in the trash can, fluttering like broken wings. Later that evening, he sat with his father outside their small home on the edge of the reservation. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dry earth. His father, Red Eagle, was mending an old satchel. "You okay?" he asked without looking up. Tomas nodded. "They took my notebook. Said I wasn't American enough." Red Eagle smiled, not bitter, but knowing. "They always say that. But remember, Tomas, we were here before the flag, before the English, before the borders." Tomas looked down. "I want to believe that." His father tied the last knot on the satchel and handed it to him. "Belief isn't enough. You carry it, every day, in your tongue, in your blood, in your silence, when they expect you to scream." And in that moment, something changed. Tomas didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just stared out at the horizon, where the land met the sky unchanged, unconquered. The world might have decided what papers made someone a citizen, what flag made someone American, but the land knew better. And so did he. The knock of the wind against the cabin wall made a soft rhythm, like a distant drumbeat. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the worn floorboards. Tomas sat cross-legged in front of his father, the satchel still in his lap. Red Eagle leaned back in his wooden chair, the same one he carved when Tomas was born. He was quiet tonight, more than usual. Tomas had learned by now that silence wasn't absence. With his father, it was memory. Finally, Red Eagle cleared his throat. "You want to know why I never burned that uniform?" Tomas nodded. And so, the story began. It was the spring of 1918, deep in the forests of France, and the world smelled like blood, smoke, and metal. Private Red Eagle ran low across the dirt, boots heavy with mud, his rifle gripped tight. He wasn't alone. There were boys from Kentucky, Georgia, Texas, all yelling orders he didn't understand at first. The army had stripped him of his braids, renamed him John Eagle, and crammed him into a tent with men who called him chief like it was funny. He didn't laugh. He spoke little, but when it came to marching, to surviving, he listened. He watched. He endured. And when the bullets came, he didn't flinch. They had been moving through the Argonne forest, chasing ghosts and smoke. That's when it happened. The explosion hit just ahead of the line, a mine. The blast was deafening. When the dirt settled, one of the officers lay screaming, half covered in debris. His legs twisted beneath the wreckage of a shattered tree. Every man dove for cover, except Red Eagle. He dropped his rifle and sprinted. The bullets came close. He could hear them snapping leaves, but he didn't stop. The man, Lieutenant James Harrow, was white, a Harvard man, maybe 25. He was bleeding badly, crying out for help, for God, for his mother. Red Eagle didn't say a word. He just lifted the officer over his shoulders and carried him back across open field, 50 yards of death, and not a single soldier followed. When they reached the trench, Red Eagle collapsed, his back torn by shrapnel. But Harrow was alive. Back in the cabin, Tomas was wide-eyed. "You never told me that." Red Eagle gave a tired smile. Wasn't the kind of thing anyone cared about. Tomas frowned. "Did he ever thank you?" His father nodded slowly. "He did. Right there, before they took him away. Said, 'You saved my life. When this is over, I'll make sure your people are treated right.'" Tomas sat in silence for a moment, staring into the flames. What happened to him? Red Eagle exhaled through his nose. He became somebody. Big name now. Senator, I think. There was something bitter in his voice. Not quite anger, not quite regret. Just the sound of a man who'd learned how the world really worked. The next day, Tomas walked the long road into town alone. He stopped at the public library, a place where the librarian never looked him in the eye, and sat down in front of the old newspaper archives. He found him. James Harrow, senator, decorated war veteran, advocate for veterans' rights, proud American. There was even a quote from a recent speech: "We must never forget those who fought for this great nation, no matter their background." Tomas stared at the screen. Then he copied the name down in his notebook, the one they hadn't found yet. When he came home, his father was splitting wood behind the house. Tomas held up the page. He remembers war, just not the man who saved him. Red Eagle didn't stop chopping. That's the American way, son. They take what they need and forget the rest. Tomas looked away. He's a senator now. He could do something, fix something. His father paused. "You think justice is something men give out like candy? That they just hand it to you because you earned it?" He shook his head. "It don't work like that." Tomas stepped closer. "But he promised you." Red Eagle looked up then, his eyes hard. "So did this country." The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke. That night, Tomas couldn't sleep. The wind was louder now, howling through the cracks of the cabin like an animal that wanted in. He imagined his father, 19 years old, bleeding in a trench beside a man who would one day stand in a marble hall in Washington, speaking of honor and sacrifice, while the man who saved him was still denied the right to vote. Was it cowardice to let that go, or was it something else? Survival. Tomas didn't have the answer, but he knew he couldn't forget it. A week later, they received a letter in the mail. Thick envelope. Government seal. It was from Senator Harrow's office. A generic newsletter. A fundraiser for veterans. Red Eagle didn't even open it. He tossed it in the fire. Tomas picked up the ash after. There, barely legible on the burned edge, were the words, "Your service matters." Tomas stared at it, then whispered under his breath, "Not if you're brown, not if you remember who you were before the war." Outside, snow had started to fall. The summer of 1924 came quietly, with thick air and long, heavy silences. Tomas was 17 now, taller, quieter. His hair had grown back some, thick and black like his father's. He didn't smile much anymore, Not after the last 2 years, not after what he'd seen. And yet, that day, there was hope. The town paper, the Red River Gazette, printed it on the front page in bold letters: Indian Citizenship Act passed. All Native Americans now recognized as U.S. citizens. Tomas brought the paper home like it was gold, slapped it down on the kitchen table. "We made it," he whispered. Red Eagle looked at it, didn't move, just leaned in, read the headline slowly, then said, "Words are easier than change. But this is law," Tomas insisted. "You fought for this country. You saved a senator. They can't ignore you now." His father stared at the paper a little longer, then folded it gently like it might crumble and said, "We'll see." They got dressed early that morning. Red Eagle wore his old uniform. The buttons had dulled, but he polished them anyway. Tomas helped him brush the jacket clean, combed back his father's hair like he used to as a boy. The county courthouse was just 5 miles into town, but it felt like walking to the edge of a different world. White folks stared. Some muttered. Others turned their backs. But Red Eagle kept walking head high, boots steady. They arrived just after noon. The line was short. Inside, the walls were covered in flags. A sign above the desk read, "Register to vote. It's your American right." Tomas smiled. "This is it." They stepped forward. A clerk behind the desk looked up. She was middle-aged, pale as chalk, with a tight bun and tighter smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Red Eagle said. "I'm here to register to vote." The woman looked him over. "Tribe?" "Ojibwe." She didn't write anything down, just reached under the desk and pulled out a form. "Fill this out, then we'll see." Red Eagle sat down at the corner table. Tomas stood behind him, watching his father carefully print his name, his service record, his address. When he handed the form back, the woman looked it over, then frowned. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. "You're not eligible at this time." Tomas blinked. "What? The law passed last month. He's a citizen now." She didn't even look at him. "Yes, but this is a state issue. Oklahoma still requires proof of residence in a fixed structure for at least 5 years, literacy test, and payment of the poll tax. But he lives here," Tomas said. "He fought in the war. He can read." I'm sorry," she repeated, louder this time. "He does not qualify under current regulations." Red Eagle didn't say a word. He simply reached down, took the paper back from her hand, folded it slowly, and placed it in his coat pocket. Then he turned and walked out. Tomas followed, fuming. "This isn't right. You should fight it. Write a letter. Go to the newspaper. Something." His father didn't stop walking. "No one's listening, son. They just needed the law for the headlines, not for us." "But they passed it," Tomas said, almost shouting. "They said we were citizens." Red Eagle stopped cold in the middle of the street. He turned slowly to face his son. "They say a lot of things." Tomas felt his breath catch. The town was quiet around them, too quiet. A white man in a store window stared, then pulled the curtain closed. Red Eagle looked back toward the courthouse. That woman's desk? It wasn't a desk. It was a gate. And the people behind it are gatekeepers. They don't need chains anymore, Tomas. They've got paperwork. That night, Tomas couldn't sleep again. He sat by the fire, flipping through his old notebook. On one page, he wrote, "June 15th, 1924, my father wore his uniform." They wore excuses. He thought of burning it, then thought better. Instead, he tore out one blank page and began writing a letter to the editor, to the governor, to no one in particular, maybe just to history. Days passed. The news moved on. There were parades in other towns celebrating Native inclusion, photos of white politicians shaking hands with men in feathers and beaded shirts, costumes for cameras. None of those men lived in Red River. Here, Red Eagle chopped wood. Tomas read history books full of names that looked nothing like his. One afternoon, as they sat outside, Tomas asked, "Do you regret fighting in the war?" Red Eagle thought for a long time, then said, "No." Tomas waited, but his father didn't add anything. Finally, Red Eagle spoke again. "I fought because they forced me, but I saved that man because it was right. That doesn't belong to them. That belongs to me." Tomas nodded slowly. "Even if they never let you vote?" Red Eagle's eyes flicked to the horizon. "One day they'll let you." He never went back to the courthouse. But that uniform? He kept it clean, hung it by the door, not for pride, not for country, but for memory. The wind was loud that morning, louder than usual. It screamed through the window cracks of the boarding school dormitory, pushing against the thin, creaky walls like it wanted to tear the place down. Tomas sat on his narrow cot, eyes fixed on the ceiling above. The boards were stained with time, and in one corner someone had etched the shape of a hawk. He didn't know who carved it, but he stared at it every morning, like it might lift him away. On the floor next to him was his satchel, the one his father had mended. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath his history book and a pencil stub, was his real notebook, the forbidden one. He waited until the bell rang and the other boys filed out, their boots thudding in unison like they'd all been trained in the same silence. When it was clear, he pulled the notebook from the cloth, opened it to a blank page, and began to write. Gigadun, to speak. He underlined the word, wrote it again, then added, they fear what they do not want to understand. Mr. Carter's voice echoed through the hallway before he even entered. History quiz today. Pages open, mouths closed. Tomas slid the notebook back into its hiding place and stood just in time for the door to swing open. Mr. Carter's boots were polished, his tie too tight, like he was always choking on his own importance. His eyes scanned the room, landing too long on Tomas, like always. Whitecloud, he said. You're not drawing today, are you? No, sir, Tomas replied, steady. Good, Carter muttered. Maybe you're learning. The quiz was on the Constitution. The paper asked about the Founding Fathers, about liberty and justice, and the rights of citizens. Tomas stared at the last question. Who is guaranteed the right to vote under U.S. law? His pencil hovered. He thought of his father's uniform hanging by the door. Thought of the woman at the courthouse desk, her cold voice. You're not eligible. He wrote a single word, not me, then folded the paper in half and turned it in. That afternoon, Tomas sat alone in the library. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock and the scratching of a boy 2 tables over, writing something in cursive. Tomas opened his notebook again, slowly, carefully. He wrote another word, Anji Majitata. Let us begin again. He was halfway through writing a line in Ojibwe when a shadow moved across the page, Mr. Carter. He stood there without speaking. Then, in a single swift motion, he reached down and yanked the notebook from Tomas's hands. What is this? Tomas stood. It's mine. Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. This is not English. No, sir. You've been warned, haven't you? Carter's voice rose. You're here to learn our ways, not cling to your savage tongue. Tomas's jaw tightened. It's not savage. Mr. Carter leaned closer. You want to be an American? Then speak like one. Tomas didn't answer. Carter opened the notebook and flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the careful handwriting, the translations, the prayers. His lip curled. This is subversion, he hissed. You think you're clever, hiding your tribe's language in here, like a weapon? Tomas said nothing. Mr. Carter slammed the notebook shut. You'll report to the headmaster's office after supper. And don't think you're getting this back. He turned and walked off, the notebook clenched in his hand. That night, Tomas didn't eat. He sat on the steps of the dormitory, staring at the moon, arms wrapped around his knees. When the bell rang for curfew, he didn't move. He remembered something his grandmother once told him before they sent him away. She'd held his face in her hands and said, Your words are old, older than the land they walk on. Don't let them be buried. But here, in this place, they weren't just buried. They were hunted. The headmaster's office was colder than the rest of the building. Books lined the walls, volumes of English grammar, government, and Christian morality. The headmaster didn't look up when Tomas entered. Sit, Tomas did. Mr. Carter tells me you've been keeping a secret journal in a forbidden language. Yes, sir. The headmaster raised an eyebrow. You admit it? I do. A long silence. Then, with exaggerated calm, he said, Do you understand that this school exists to prepare you for life in American society? That your old ways, your primitive speech, it has no place in the modern world? Tomas looked him in the eye. My father fought in your war, bled for your flag, and you still won't let him vote? The headmaster blinked. He hadn't expected that. Tomas continued, voice firm. Maybe your world needs more languages, not fewer. There was a flicker of something in the man's eyes, anger, perhaps, or discomfort. He reached into the desk, pulled out the notebook. I should burn this. Tomas stood. Go ahead, burn it. He pointed to his chest. But the words are still in here. You can't burn what you can't see. They stared at each other. Then the headmaster slid the notebook into a drawer. You're suspended. 3 weeks. You'll report to labor detail when you return. Tomas nodded once, turned, and walked out. That night, back in the dormitory, he told the others what happened. One boy leaned in. You're not afraid? Tomas looked down, then smiled small, defiant. I'm more afraid of forgetting. Fall came early that year. The trees turned brittle shades of red and copper before September was even half gone, and the wind carried a chill that seemed older than the land itself. It was the kind of cold that wrapped around bones, not skin. Tomas was home again, suspended from school, but not defeated. His days were quieter, now spent chopping wood, helping his father mend fences, walking the fields in long, thoughtful silence. And every night he wrote, not in English, not for grades. He wrote in Ojibwe, for memory, for breath, for the people who were being erased in silence. On a Thursday morning, Red Eagle brought home a letter. The envelope was thick, official. The return address, State Election Board, Oklahoma City. He didn't open it right away. He placed it on the table like a trap. Tomas sat across from him, watching. Is it about your application? He asked. Red Eagle nodded once. They said they'd review it after the law passed, maybe now. He didn't finish the sentence. He opened the envelope slowly, like peeling back something sacred. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typewritten, impersonal. Tomas read it over his father's shoulder. Dear Mr. Red Eagle, thank you for your recent application to register as a voter in the state of Oklahoma. Per current state law, all applicants must satisfy the following: proof of residency in a permanent structure for no less than 5 years, completion of state literacy examination, payment of applicable poll tax. At this time, we are unable to approve your application. Respectfully, Office of Voter Registration. Red Eagle folded the letter once, then again, then again. He placed it back in the envelope and said nothing. Tomas stared at him. They're still saying no. His father didn't look up. The law gave us the title. The state took the power. Later that evening, Tomas took the letter and read it again under the oil lamp. Each line was a knife, a bureaucratic blade. He didn't know what hurt more, that they denied his father again, or that they made it sound so polite, so clean. The next Sunday, they went to town for supplies. Outside the general store, a white man in a gray suit stood on a crate, shouting into the open air, Ladies and gentlemen, this country must protect its real citizens. Tomas and Red Eagle froze mid-step. They're giving the vote away to anyone now. Indians, Negroes, immigrants. What's next? Wolves voting in the forest? People laughed. The man kept going. Citizenship isn't just a word. It's earned. These people weren't there in Philadelphia in 1776, and they sure as hell weren't invited to the party. Red Eagle said nothing, just kept walking. But Tomas, he looked back. He locked eyes with the man on the crate, just for a second, and the man went quiet. Tomas held that silence like a victory. That night, back at the cabin, Red Eagle sat by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife he hadn't used in years. Tomas sat across from him, notebook in hand. You ever think about leaving? He asked. Just going somewhere we're not ghosts. Red Eagle didn't stop sharpening. And where would that be? Tomas didn't have an answer. His father looked up. You run far enough, you stop being a ghost. You become a shadow. That's not better. Tomas looked down at his pages. Then what do we do? Red Eagle's voice was low but steady. We stay. We speak. We remember. A few days later, Tomas went into town again. Alone this time. He walked straight to the county clerk's office. The woman at the desk blinked when she saw him. He was taller now, sharper around the edges. Can I help you? She asked. I want to register to vote, Tomas said. Her eyes narrowed. You're still too young. I turn 18 in 2 months, he replied. Just wanted to make sure the door's still locked. She didn't respond. Tomas smiled. It's okay. I'll be back. That night, he wrote in his notebook, they gave us keys with no locks, names with no power, but the silence they force us into it echoes louder than they think. He closed the book, placed it under his cot, and whispered to the night, I am not afraid of your paper walls. The first snow came early. The fields went white. The trees stood still. And somewhere in the state capitol, a new law was being written, one that would demand ID cards for voting. Another layer, another lock. But Tomas knew something they didn't. You can chain a man's hands. You can silence his language. You can deny his ballot. But you cannot make him forget. And you cannot stop what he teaches his children. The snow had begun to melt when Tomas first saw the article. It was buried on page 3 of the Red River Gazette, tucked between a church bake sale announcement and a notice about a new train route. But the headline was unmistakable. Senator James Harrow to visit Oklahoma, Veterans Event to honor WWI heroes. Thomas read the name twice. Then again, James Harrow, Lieutenant Harrow, the man his father had carried on his back through a battlefield of fire and shrapnel. The man who said, I'll never forget what you did for me. The man who did. Tomas folded the paper and walked outside. Red Eagle was repairing the fence along the edge of the property, his movements slow but steady. Did you know he was coming? Tomas asked. Red Eagle didn't look up. Who? Senator Harrow. The post-hole digger paused mid-swing. For a moment, all Tomas heard was wind. No, his father said. I didn't. Tomas stepped closer. They're having a ceremony for veterans in Tulsa. He hesitated. You should go. Talk to him. Make him remember. Red Eagle finally met his son's eyes. And in them, Tomas didn't see excitement. He saw something else. Something colder. I don't need to remind a man of the truth he chose to forget. But Tomas wouldn't let it go. 2 days later, he borrowed a neighbor's wagon and set off for Tulsa, his father silent in the passenger seat the entire ride. The event was held at a marble monument just outside the city. White columns, waving flags, clean suits, and brass bands. It smelled like fresh paint and performance. Tomas hated it instantly. They walked up the steps, eyes from the crowd sliding across them like oil. Some people smiled politely. Others didn't look at them at all. At the front stood Senator James Harrow, shaking hands with other veterans, older now, grayer, his medals catching the afternoon sun. Tomas nudged his father forward. Go, he said softly. He's right there. Red Eagle didn't move. So Tomas stepped up first. Senator Harrow? The man turned, still smiling. Yes? My name is Tomas Whitecloud. This is my father, Red Eagle. You knew him. Harrow's eyes narrowed, searching. I'm sorry, in France, Tomas said. The Argonne Forest. You were injured. He carried you back, saved your life. A flicker of something passed through Harrow's eyes, surprise, confusion, guilt. I've met many soldiers, he said. It was a long time ago. Tomas felt his fists clench. You said you'd never forget him. Harrow's smile faltered. He looked at Red Eagle. I appreciate your service, he said, reaching out his hand like it was enough. Red Eagle didn't take it. He just looked the man in the eye and said, You remembered the war, but not the people who bled for you. Harrow dropped his hand. His voice grew thin. I'm sorry, sir. I don't mean any offense. Red Eagle turned away. Tomas stared at Harrow for a long moment before following. They sat in silence the whole ride home. At some point, Tomas whispered, How could he forget? Red Eagle answered without looking up. He didn't forget, son. He erased. That night, Tomas couldn't sleep. He sat outside by the fire pit, flipping through his notebook. The last entry he wrote echoed in his mind. They gave us keys with no locks. Now he added something new. They gave us war, but never peace. They gave us uniforms, but never names. A week later, Red Eagle went into town to sell hides. Tomas stayed home, chopping firewood. When his father returned, there was a box in the back of the wagon. Tomas opened it. Inside was a framed certificate, stamped with the seal of the United States Senate. In honor of Red Eagle, for his bravery in World War I. No rank, no tribal name, no mention of the Argonne, just one line at the bottom, We thank you for your service." Tomas laughed, a bitter, breathless laugh. He turned to his father. "This is their apology?" Red Eagle just said, "It's their proof they never knew me." That Sunday, Tomas returned to the place he buried his first notebook. He dug it up, wiped off the dirt, and sat beneath the tree line where the old hawk still circled the sky. He opened to the first page. Giejidun, to speak. He underlined it. Then, on the next line, wrote, "Memories stolen are never truly gone. They just wait for someone to say them out loud again." In the distance, the town's church bells rang, the same bells that tolled on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and the 4th of July. But this time, Tomas didn't listen. He was writing his own history now, and this one wouldn't forget his father's name. The year was 1942. America was at war again, and young men were once more boarding trains with flags on their sleeves and fear in their chests. Tomas Whitecloud wasn't going. He was 21 now, his hair long again, tied at the nape of his neck with a simple leather cord, his shoulders broad, his eyes steady. He had his father's quiet and his mother's fire. And today, he was walking toward the Red River polling station. The town hadn't changed much. Same dusty roads, same faded white buildings, same sideways glances from people who still called his family the Indians by the tree line. But Tomas wasn't here for their stares. He was here for the door, the same door his father once walked through wearing his uniform, heart full of hope, only to be turned away by a woman with a list and a smile. Tomas had received his registration card in the mail 3 weeks earlier. No tests, no taxes, no denials. On paper, he was finally legally a citizen, but papers lied, and he knew better than to believe them at face value. He reached the building. The courthouse stood tall, stone and cold. 2 flags waved lazily in the breeze, one American, one state. A young soldier in uniform exited, smiling, his "I voted" sticker proudly pinned to his chest. Tomas stepped aside, watched him walk away, then turned back to the door. He stood there for a long time, didn't reach for the handle, didn't move forward. Instead, he pulled a small satchel from his jacket, the same one his father had repaired years ago. From it, he drew a leather-bound notebook, worn, creased, still smelling faintly of fire and soil. He walked up to the building's stone steps, climbed halfway, then stopped. At the edge of the door, where the sunlight split shadow from stone, Tomas knelt. He opened the notebook and wrote one final sentence. "I was here. I saw. I remember." Then he tore the page out, folded it carefully, placed it on the step, under a smooth river rock he had carried in his pocket since morning. A silent offering. A different kind of vote. Inside, the line moved. The ballots were cast. Boxes checked. Names recorded. Outside, Tomas sat down on the bottom step, looking out over the town, over the fields, over everything his people had walked before borders had names. He remembered his father's words, "They don't need walls to trap us. They have paper." But Tomas had learned something else. Paper could trap, but it could also bear witness. He didn't need to enter that room to prove anything. The fact that he had the right now, it didn't erase what had been taken. Didn't resurrect the dignity buried under decades of silence. They had made voting a ceremony he was never invited to, so he made his own. The wind picked up. A child ran past, holding a red balloon, his mother not far behind. Neither looked at him, but that was fine. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to remember. Later that night, Tomas walked home along the same dirt road his father once took after being turned away. Only this time, there was no shame. Only the quiet certainty that memory could outlive laws. Back at the cabin, he placed the notebook back in its spot beneath the floorboard, next to a folded flag and a faded photograph of a younger Red Eagle in uniform standing tall, unsmiling, beside an unnamed white soldier. Tomas looked out the window. The moon was full. In the woods beyond the clearing, a drumbeat began faint at first, then rising. A song he hadn't heard in years. A gathering. He followed the sound. They were there, dozens of them, tribes from nearby, gathering in secret under the trees like their ancestors once had. Some wore traditional dress, others plain work clothes, but all of them carried something old, something sacred. Tomas joined the circle. No one asked why he came. No one needed to. He raised his voice with theirs, in a language this country once tried to silence. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. Not American, not rejected, just Tomas Whitecloud, son of Red Eagle, a voice they couldn't erase. In the morning, someone at the courthouse would find the folded note and the river stone. They might throw it away, or they might read it. But either way, his story had been written, and this time no one would forget his name. If this story made you feel something, anger, sorrow, or even just a flicker of truth, drop a 1 in the comments to let the world know you're still paying attention. These stories aren't just history. They're warnings carved into silence. And if we don't speak their names, no one will. The lesson? Justice isn't about laws. It's about memory. And sometimes, the loudest form of protest is to remember what they wanted us to forget.